Chapters 29 and 30 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. 29. 1812. The War with Russia. There has recently been published in Paris a little book entitled Napoleon, the First Creditor of Prussia, in which it is stated that although the Emperor occupied the whole of Prussia with his armies for several years, he never succeeded in collecting the indemnity agreed on in the Treaty of Tilsit. The Prussians were as successful in evading payment as are their descendants of today. A new convention was signed in 1808, but Frederick William again managed to put the matter off, in the hope that Austria would defeat France. After Wagram, Hardenberg consented, in principle, to pay in bonds and in kind for the evacuation of Prussia by the French troops, but the Spanish War forced Napoleon to withdraw most of his army, and once more payment was avoided. It was not until 1812, therefore, that Napoleon succeeded in collecting some small part of his claim in provisions and transportation for his troops passing through Germany. On the 24th February, 1812, a treaty of alliance, offensive and defensive, was concluded between France and Prussia, under which the king engaged to furnish a contingent of 20,000 men and 60 cannon, in case of war with Russia. Napoleon placed but little confidence in this alliance, and seems to have taken these troops more as hostages than anything else. The day after this treaty was signed, Napoleon sent for Colonel Tchernacheff, and in a very conciliatory interview insisted upon knowing the real grievances of Russia. "The more I reflect upon it," he said, "the less I can reconcile myself to the idea that a war can break out between the Emperor Alexander and myself." The colonel stated the complaints of the Czar as he understood them. They were principally two. First, the supposed intention of Napoleon to re-establish the kingdom of Poland. Second, the occupation of the Duchy of Oldenburg. On the first point, Napoleon said that he had no intention of re-establishing Poland, that he had given his word to that effect and would renew it. As to Oldenburg, his action was dictated by the necessity of closing a port of entry for English goods, and he had offered, by way of indemnity, to give an equivalent territory to the rulers. In turn he complained of the failure of Russia to exclude English commerce, and the discrimination against French goods. "After all," he said, "these discussions are not worth a cannon shot. Return to the Emperor Alexander, and give him this letter. Tell him, above all, that I pray him not to postpone longer the negotiations which should put an end to these misunderstandings." The letter of the Emperor was brief but polite. It was mainly a repetition of his verbal assurances. "I have taken the course," he said, "of talking over with Colonel Tchernacheff the disquieting affairs which have arisen during the past 15 months. It only depends upon your Majesty to end them all. I beg your Majesty never to doubt my desire to give him proofs of the distinguished consideration which I have for his person." Armed with this letter, which was equivalent to a dismissal, the colonel made his preparations to depart, and only remained a few hours in Paris. Knowing that he was under suspicion because of his efforts to obtain information regarding the new organization of the Grand Army, before leaving he destroyed a large number of papers. This precaution was not superfluous, for he had hardly vacated his apartment before it was visited by the police. In the fireplace of his bedroom were found the ashes of burnt papers. In making their search the police removed a rug before the mantel, and under it they found a letter which had escaped destruction, signed only with the initial M. This communication proved conclusively that Tchernacheff was a spy, and put the police upon the track of the French traitor. Suspicion was at once directed to a man named Michel, who was employed as a copyist in the War Office. It was not difficult to secure a page in his handwriting, and a comparison with the letter left no doubts as to the identity of the criminal. An hour later Michel was arrested, confronted with the evidence against him, and confessed his guilt. It was found, on further investigation, that these treasonable practices, conducted by Russian agents, had been going on for 8 or 9 years, and had not been interrupted even by the alliance of 1807. The ambassadors apparently were not involved, but there was always some one on their staff who was engaged in this odious traffic. From reasons of public policy the matter was kept quiet for several weeks, but in April Michel was put on trial for high treason, condemned and executed. Austria would have preferred to remain neutral in the coming conflict, but this was impossible, and she was forced to yield to the demands of the Emperor. On the 14th March a treaty was signed, under which Francis agreed to furnish 30,000 men, including 6,000 cavalry. As in the case of Prussia, it was stipulated that these troops were not to be sent to Spain. Such were the benefits of the Austrian marriage. In signing this treaty, Napoleon and Francis agreed with each other that it should be kept a secret as long as possible. But it was revealed inopportunely by an Austrian envoy. The Emperor Francis was then represented at Stockholm by Comte de Neipperg, the man who was to cause Marie-Louise to forget Napoleon, and thus become known to history. Informed of the treaty, Neipperg took it upon himself to communicate it officially to the Swedish government, and of course it was immediately known at St. Petersburg. This news produced a profound impression upon the Czar. Knowing the state of slavery in which Prussia existed, he had long given up hopes of any assistance from that power, but up to the last he had relied upon the neutrality at least of Austria. Without causing Alexander to weaken, or feel more disposed to make peace, this bitter news led him finally to adopt the plan of an absolute defensive. With Austria in alliance with France, an advance into Poland would expose his army to a flank attack. Therefore, upon his arrival at Vilna, he gave his final orders to await the attack within the Russian frontiers. This resolution, which was destined to save Russia, was definitely reached by Alexander only at the last hour, and was due entirely to reasons beyond his control. The very measure taken by Napoleon to render his success certain was to be the main cause of his failure. If the Russians had advanced to the Vistula, as Alexander proposed up to the last moment, a conflict with the superior French forces would have resulted in certain disaster. The negotiations conducted at the same time for an alliance with Sweden were complicated by an unfortunate act of Marshal Davout. Through an excess of zeal, in January, he sent some of his troops to take possession of the island of Rügen in Swedish Pomerania, in order to prevent the landing of British goods. Bernadotte, whose decision was already made, used this violation of his territory as a pretext for throwing himself into the arms of Alexander. On the 24th March he signed a treaty with Russia, in which he agreed to furnish 30,000 troops. The price of his treason to his native land was to be Norway, which would be seized from Denmark. On the 27th of April Kourakin asked for an audience. He brought the reply of the Czar to Napoleon's latest Pacific overtures. As a basis for any further negotiations, Alexander demanded: 1. The entire evacuation of Prussia. 2. A reduction in the garrison of Danzig. 3. The evacuation of Swedish Pomerania. And 4. A satisfactory arrangement with Sweden. Such arrogant demands clearly showed that the Czar was decided upon war, and he had no desire for further negotiations. But Napoleon, in order to gain a little more time, sent his aide-de-camp Narbonne to Russia with another message to Alexander. He also, for the 4th time, offered peace to England, but the government again replied that it could only treat on the basis of the recognition of Ferdinand VII. At the same moment that the Russian ambassador was delivering his ultimatum to Napoleon, Alexander left his capital for the headquarters of his army at Vilna, where he arrived on the 28th of April. On the 1st day of May the Grand Army was concentrated behind the Vistula, ready to enter Russia, but Napoleon was still detained at Paris by an unforeseen difficulty, which was destined to have a disastrous effect upon his chances for success. The 1811 crops in France had been a failure, and during the following winter the price of bread had become so dear as to cause great privation among the poor. The evils of an intensely centralized government were never more apparent than on this occasion, when Napoleon was forced to postpone his departure for a month in order to direct personally the work of relief. At this time Marie-Louise wrote her father: "The Emperor charges me to give you his best regards, and to assure you, if there is a war one of these days, he will take me with him to Dresden, where I shall remain a month or two, and where he hopes also to see you. You cannot conceive, my dear papa, the joy which this prospect gives me. I am sure that you will not refuse my request, and that you will also give me the pleasure of bringing with you mamma and my brothers and sisters, that I may have the privilege of seeing them. I ask you, my very dear papa, not to speak of this plan, because nothing is yet settled." However, everything was so fully decided that, on the 30th of March, the Emperor departed for St. Cloud with the Empress, in order to secure a little rest, although they were forced to leave the King, who was ill, behind them at the Elysee. Their life during the following month was very tranquil, the Emperor spending as much time as possible in the open air. Several mornings he aroused the Empress at dawn, to ride with him, either in the park, or to visit the work going on at Paris. Finally, on the 9th of May, without returning to Paris, without any proclamation to the nation, or message to the Senate, the Emperor left St. Cloud under the pretext of going on a tour of inspection to the grand army assembled upon the Vistula. On the eve of every other campaign, from Marengo to Wagram, Napoleon had given his reasons, and published the documents which explained his course. This time, nothing. And by way of a curtain raiser to this war, the most dangerous he has ever undertaken, he has arranged for a fortnight of fetes at Dresden, where he conducts the Empress, and where he has invited to meet him and do him homage all his allies and vassals. Never had a departure for the army so much resembled a pleasure trip. The visit to Dresden was probably the happiest moment in the life of Marie-Louise. With full confidence in the prestige of Napoleon, she regarded victory as certain. No doubts of the future troubled her. Not yet 20 years of age, she looked forward to meeting again the members of her family, and appearing before them in all the éclat of her glory as Empress of the French. She left St. Cloud at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 9th of May with the Emperor, in the new traveling coach built for him the previous year, the same one afterwards captured by the Prussians at Waterloo, and now in the collection of Madame Tussaud at London. They had no military escort, but were accompanied by a suite of 38 persons. Out of consideration for the Empress, the journey was made by easy stages, stopping for the nights at Chalons, Metz, Mayence, Würzburg, Beyrout, and Plauen. They were met at Freiburg with the King and Queen of Saxony, who escorted them to Dresden, where they arrived at 11 o'clock on the night of the 16th of May, and were lodged in the royal palace in the former apartments of Augustus II, King of Poland and Elector of Saxony. The whole city was illuminated, the garrison was under arms, cannon were fired, and bells rung. At the palace the royal family and the entire court were gathered to salute the Emperor. The next day there arrived the Grand Duke of Würzburg and the Queen of Westphalia, followed 24 hours later by the Emperor and Empress of Austria, whom Marie-Louise had not seen since her marriage 2 years before. Francis had come much against his inclination, and his wife, notoriously hostile to Napoleon, assumed the posture of a victim led to the slaughter. She could neither forgive nor forget the injuries of Napoleon, and was exasperated to see the splendors of her stepdaughter. The rather fulsome flatteries of the Saxon court to Napoleon only aggravated the situation. In vain Napoleon employed all his powers of fascination to overcome the hostility of his mother-in-law. At the table he ordered that she should be given the place of honor, with Louise at her left, and the Emperor Francis next to his daughter, while he himself sat at the right of Beatrice. If she had always hated Napoleon, she now learned to detest her stepdaughter, if possible even more. The Austrian courtiers found Louise much improved. Her figure, they said, has become very elegant. She has now the prettiest form in the world, and a charming little foot. Besides, nothing could be more brilliant than her suite. She had, they said, 150 attendants, while the Emperor Francis had only 2. Then, to cap the climax, there were her robes and her jewels. Napoleon tried to have Louise show more moderation in her toilettes, but finally ended on every occasion by yielding to his wife's tears. She took a childish pleasure in outshining her stepmother. All the advantages which Napoleon had hoped to gain from this interview with the Emperor Francis were nullified by this little woman, who ruled her husband absolutely. Learning much to her dismay that Francis proposed to command in person the Austrian contingent, and make the campaign with Napoleon, she opposed this plan with all her force. She finally appealed to Metternich, who took her part, and the project was abandoned. This little domestic drama passed almost unperceived in the midst of the daily fetes, the promenades in carriages, the hunting parties, the banquets, the spectacles, the concerts, in which took part Saxony, Prussia, Weimar, Mecklenburg, Coburg, Reuss, all groveling on their knees before their mortal enemy. On the 26th of May the King of Prussia arrived, followed by his son, the Prince Royal, for whom the King solicited the position of aide de camp on the staff of Napoleon. At the same time Ferdinand asked the Emperor to give his brother, Don Carlos, the command of the Spanish troops who were going to Russia. When we think of all this servility, it is not remarkable that Napoleon believed in the sincerity and devotion of his allies. It was not, as often stated, solely for the satisfaction of his amour propre that the Emperor had convoked this gathering of his crowned vassals. Conserving even to the last minute the hope of averting the war, Napoleon imagined that the Czar might be impressed by the menace of this formidable coalition, and brought back to more pacific ideas. But Alexander knew better than Napoleon the worth of these alliances and the sincerity of these homages. On his arrival at Vilna, Comte de Narbonne tried in vain to reopen the negotiations. Alexander was cold and inflexible. Lauriston, who was sent later, could not even obtain an interview. On the 29th of May, Alexander published a decree opening all the ports of Russia to the commerce of all nations, and the same day Napoleon left Dresden to place himself at the head of his armies. Although many volumes have been written on the Russian campaign, there still exists much misinformation on the subject. The strategy so successfully employed by the Russians was due to circumstances rather than any preconceived plan. With an army of less than 250,000 men, they were forced to meet more than 500,000 invaders under the greatest captain of modern times. Nevertheless, the Russian commanders expected to fight, and the defensive tactics adopted were the result of the overwhelming superiority of the French forces. The size of Napoleon's army, paradoxical as this may seem, was one of the principal causes of his failure. He would have done better if he had left a large part of his forces in reserve behind the Niemen. There were no roads worthy of the name in Russia, and it was physically impossible to supply such an enormous host. There were too many wagons, and far too many camp followers, especially the notorious love escort, tolerated in the armies of the Republic and the Empire. From the very outset, the success of the campaign was jeopardized by this impedimenta. Knowing that this war was not to be fought in a fertile land like the valleys of the Po and the Danube, where the soldiers could live off the country, Napoleon had organized his transportation on the largest scale. Supplies had been drawn from every possible source, and nothing was neglected for the comfort of his men. Napoleon never forgot his maxim that "an army marches on its belly." The first important battle was fought on the 17th of August, at Smolensk. The Russians under Barclay were defeated, but escaped destruction, and continued their retreat eastward. At Dresden, Napoleon had told Metternich that he did not intend to go beyond this point in the campaign of 1812. The city lies on the south bank of the Dnieper, in a beautiful amphitheater of hills. It was a "sacred city," one of the oldest in Russia, and had at one time contained 80,000 inhabitants, but had dwindled to not more than a quarter that number. At this point, about half-way from Vilna to Moscow, Napoleon should have paused, as he first proposed, and put his army in winter quarters. As he was drawing supplies from the richest part of the Empire, the Russians would sooner or later have been obliged to advance and attack him. Leaving his army there, Napoleon could personally have returned to France, obtained new recruits, organized a better system of supplies, and renewed the campaign in 1813 with every chance of success. To continue the advance to Moscow was to court disaster. It is difficult to agree with such eminent authorities as Jomini and Clausewitz, who approve of Napoleon's final decision as his only proper course. Continuing his pursuit, on the 5th September, Napoleon came up with the Russians, who were posted in a strong position at Borodino. Dissatisfied with the Fabian tactics of Barclay, Alexander had appointed Kutuzov to succeed him, with orders to fight at the first opportunity. In the battle which followed, 2 days later, Kutuzof was decisively defeated, and retreated to Moscow 60 miles away. The losses on both sides were enormous, and Napoleon was in no condition to conduct an active pursuit. He has been sharply criticized by many military writers for not putting in the guard at the decisive moment, about the middle of the afternoon. This superb body of picked troops, still 20,000 strong, might have made Borodino a crushing Russian defeat, and forced the Czar to sue for peace. But Napoleon was 2,000 miles from home, and the Guard his last reserve. If they were repulsed, his whole army would have been a flying mob in less than an hour. That his decision was wise is proved by the fact that it was the Old Guard who covered his retreat, and saved the entire army from destruction. The Russians made no attempt to defend Moscow, which was occupied by the French on the 14th September. Fires broke out the first night, and before the flames could be controlled, 2/3 of the wooden houses of which the city was built had been consumed. According to popular tradition, the Russians themselves deliberately set fire to their capital, but the conflagration was probably due to the carelessness of the soldiers who were pillaging the city. It was at this time that Napoleon made the most fatal error of this disastrous campaign. After the fire he should have begun his retreat at once, but he could not make up his mind to face defeat. He therefore tarried in Moscow a whole month, hoping from day to day that Alexander would sue for peace. On the 19th October he finally left Moscow, directing his army toward Kaluga, whence he expected to take a new southerly route toward Smolensk. But finding the Russian army in his path, he gave up this project and returned by the former route, through the region already devastated by his army. 3 weeks after leaving Moscow, the Russian winter set in, with all its rigors, and the army suffered terribly, nearly all of the horses being lost. Just before reaching Vilna on the 5th December, Napoleon turned the command over to Murat and started for France. Traveling rapidly night and day, and only stopping for a few hours at Dresden, he reached the Tuileries at 11 o'clock on the night of the 18th of December. 5 days after the departure of the Emperor from Dresden, on the 4th of June, Marie-Louise left for Prague to pass a few weeks with her family. Then, after a short visit to her uncle at Würzburg, she returned to St. Cloud, where she arrived on the 18th of July. Here she passed the summer very quietly, almost all the time alone with Madame de Montebello. She wrote the Emperor nearly every day, and heard from him by every courier, but none of this correspondence has been preserved except 2 letters of Napoleon, which were intercepted by the Russian scouts. From Moscow on the 16th of October he wrote: "Ma bonne amie, I have received your letter of the 29th September. All the good news which I have of you from every side gives me much pleasure. I see that you have the secret of making every one happy. It seems to me that the Parisians are very fond of you. They would be very difficult if they were not. I hope that you are content with the little king. If I cannot return to Paris this winter, I shall have you come to see me in Poland." The second letter was from Smolensk, under the date of 11th of November. "Ma bonne amie, you perceive that we are many days nearer each other. The weather is cold, 40 degrees. The ground covered with snow. I am thinking of you. I would love to see you. Your father should soon illegible, for you know how tenderly I love you. Kiss my son." These are far from the passionate letters addressed to Joséphine in the days of the campaign of Italy. Not a word even about the war, and the disastrous failure of the invasion. This, however, was natural, as he did not wish to alarm Marie-Louise, and he had written in the same way to Joséphine 3 years before, after his repulse at Essling. In October, a false report of the Emperor's death enabled General Malet to make a bold bid for power, and he very nearly succeeded. The seriousness of the conspiracy was concealed from Marie-Louise, who was not even alarmed. But the fragility of the imperial edifice was exposed. "What?" cried Napoleon, with unfeigned indignation. "Is one man everything here? Are institutions and pledged loyalty nothing?" They were indeed but shadows. Napoleon was everything, but he was alone. The court remained at St. Cloud much later than usual, for every one was awaiting orders from the Emperor, which he could not give. During the retreat he remained for 3 weeks without news from Paris. In this summer chateau the cold was so intense that it was impossible to warm the chambers. The 1st of December, however, it was necessary to return to Paris for the fête of the coronation, which this year was celebrated very quietly on account of the general anxiety. On the 17th December, the Moniteur published the famous 29th Bulletin, in which the Emperor revealed frankly the immensity of the disaster. The following evening Marie-Louise had just gone to bed when a noise was heard in the adjoining salon. At the same moment the door opened, and a man enveloped in furs entered. Marie-Louise uttered a cry of terror, tried to rush from the room, and found herself in the arms of her husband. 30. 1813. The Regency. During the first days after his return to Paris, Napoleon seems to have been troubled less by the loss of his army than by the blow to his dynasty. This is the first, the only thought which preoccupies him. The false report of his death had been sufficient to shake the imperial edifice upon its foundations. All his efforts of the past 3 years had been in vain. The sacrifice of Joséphine, the Austrian marriage, the birth of an heir to his throne. His first formal declaration 2 days after his return is all consecrated to this subject. In reply to the address of the Senate he says: "The glory and the power of France are close to my heart. But my first thoughts are for that which can perpetuate internal tranquillity, and render my people immune from the strife of factions and the horrors of anarchy. It is against these foes of popular welfare that I have founded, with the will and the love of the French, this throne to which are now linked the destinies of the fatherland. Our fathers had for a rallying cry, 'Le roi est mort, vive le roi!' These few words sum up the principal advantages of the monarchy. I believe that I have well studied the spirit that my people have shown through the different centuries. I have reflected upon what has been done at different epochs in our history. I shall give the matter further thought." These words strike the key note of his future programme, which had as a basis 2 fundamental principles: paternal love and the perpetuation of the Empire. When the Malais conspirators announced the death of the Emperor, not a voice in Paris was raised to cry, "Long live the Emperor!" No one had thought of his son, the King of Rome. He wishes that the people should think of the heir as in the days of the kings. The prestige which his Austrian princess has in his own eyes, he is determined that the people, the army, and all the public functionaries shall recognize. He seems to imagine that he can impose on the entire nation the ideas of perpetuity and of confidence in his dynasty. Up to this time, the Empress Marie-Louise had had no more part in the government than the Empress Joséphine. One of his favorite sayings was, "A minister of state should never permit a woman to approach his cabinet." Now he decides to bring the Empress out of the seclusion in which he has kept her, and invest her with a title which would make an impression on the masses. During the 3 months that he passed at Paris, his mind was more occupied with this idea than with subjects of much greater importance, and a brief review of his activities is necessary in order to understand some moves which have appeared casual or accidental. 3 days after his return, he ordered Regnault to make a thorough research of all the records from the reign of Charlemagne, for the forms observed in the coronation of a presumptive heir to the throne. He also directed that a similar investigation should be undertaken with regard to the regencies in French history. Within a week he received from the Imperial Printing Office a little brochure of 14 pages on the coronations, and 10 days later on the regencies. Of these pamphlets only a few copies were struck off, for the information of the principal dignitaries of the Empire. During the first 10 days of January the matter was discussed at 2 separate meetings of the Council, and the second brochure, of 41 pages, was then published simultaneously in the Moniteur and the Journal de l'Empire. Beginning with the year 578, all the regencies, 13 in number, were covered, down to the last one of Anne of Austria during the minority of Louis XIV. Then, a few days later, the text of the first brochure on the coronations was also printed in the same journals. On the 19th of January the Emperor visited Grosbois, the country estate of Marshal Berthier, for a hunting party. There he suddenly decided to go to Fontainebleau for dinner instead of returning to Paris. This move seems to have been made on the spur of the moment, for no relays had been ordered, most of the rooms in the chateau were closed for the winter, and the stoves were not lighted. When Napoleon took possession of the Papal States, the Pope had gone to Savona to live. But before leaving for the Russian campaign, the Emperor had removed him to Fontainebleau, under the pretext that he was in danger of falling into the hands of the English, whose ships were cruising off Genoa. The sole object of Napoleon's present visit was to see the Holy Father, with whom he had had no correspondence for over 3 years, or since the bulletin of excommunication had been issued. 3 weeks earlier, on the 29th December, Napoleon had taken the first step toward a reconciliation by writing Pius, "Perhaps we may be able to attain the object so much to be desired of putting an end to the differences which divide the Church and the State. For my part, I am very favorably disposed, and it will all depend on your Holiness." To this overture the Pope had responded by charging Cardinal Joseph Doria with complimentary words. Napoleon had followed the matter up by sending to Fontainebleau the Bishop of Nantes, Monseigneur Duvoisin, in whom he placed much confidence. Duvoisin found the 3 cardinals who were at Fontainebleau with the Pope very favorably disposed, and he was reinforced by 3 French bishops who strongly supported him. But the Pope still held out. He persists in saying that he has the greatest desire to satisfy the Emperor, but that his conscience does not permit him to announce his decision while alone, a prisoner without counsel. It was true that the consent of the Pope had not been asked when he was invited to take up his residence at Fontainebleau, but in every other respect he had been treated as a sovereign and not as a captive. Besides his personal suite, consisting of an almoner, a physician, a cook, and 5 other attendants, the Emperor had furnished him with a complete service. He had been received on his arrival by the Duc de Cadore, and installed in the apartment of the King of Rome. A detachment of the cavalry and infantry of the Guard had been provided as an escort and a service of honor. Napoleon thought that his visit as a guest under the roof of the Pope's residence ought to convince the Holy Father that he was not a prisoner, and should remove this final obstacle to a complete reconciliation. Napoleon reached Fontainebleau after dark, at 6:30 in the evening, and without waiting for dinner, sent an usher to demand an audience with the Pope. He was received very cordially, and the 2 sovereigns embraced each other with as much affection as 2 friends who had not met in a long time. No one had any idea of the plans of Napoleon, not even Marie-Louise, whom he had brought with him. But she was rejoiced at the apparent change in the policy of the Emperor, and felt that peace with the Church would make peace easier with Europe. During this short sojourn of a week, so different from the former visits to Fontainebleau, everyone suffered intensely from the cold. Even Napoleon felt the temperature of 6 or 7 degrees, and was obliged to exchange his small apartment on the rez-de-chaussée for one on the first floor. On the 25th of January, Napoleon signed a new concordat with the Pope. The same day, after a visit to Pius VII, Marie-Louise wrote her father, "We have been for 6 days at Fontainebleau, where to-day the Emperor has arranged the affairs of Christianity with the Pope. The Pope seemed well satisfied. He is very gay and busy since an early hour this morning. He signed the treaty a quarter of an hour ago. I have just come from his apartment. I found him very well. He has a very handsome and very interesting face. I am sure that you will learn with as much interest as myself the news of this reconciliation." The great desire of Napoleon for this reconciliation is shown by the extreme concessions which he made, amounting to a complete reversal of his former policy, and the restoration to the Pope of all his former rights and privileges as the Supreme Pontiff. The sole object which Napoleon had in view was to assure the consecration of his dynasty by Pius VII, as he himself had been invested by him. In issuing from his captivity to crown the Empress and the King of Rome, the Pope would put his seal upon the Empire in the eyes of all Europe, and assure tranquillity at home as well as peace abroad. Well satisfied with the success of his mission, on the 27th of January, after a final visit to the Pope, Napoleon returned with the Empress to Paris. On the 1st of February, still under the conviction that the entente was definite and permanent, the Emperor called a meeting of the Council and submitted the decree relative to the coronation of the Empress and the Prince Imperial, the King of Rome. With their usual subserviency to his wishes, not one of the members seems to have pointed out to the Emperor that the new decree was in violation of the fundamental law of the Empire, which in express terms declared, "Women are excluded from the Regency." 4 days later the decree was adopted, and the coronation was unofficially announced for the 7th of March. All of the vassals and allies of the Emperor were invited to be present on that date, but the notice was not made official, as Napoleon had already received warnings which made him hesitate. Rumors had reached him that the Italian cardinals included in the amnesty had regained their influence over the Pope, and that he was wavering. It was therefore necessary to act prudently. However, the matter could not remain indefinitely in a state of indecision, so the Emperor had the text of the Concordat published in the Moniteur on the day that he opened the session of the legislative body, the 14th of February, but he did not venture in his address to make any allusion to the coronation. On the 23rd March, Napoleon was finally forced to declare publicly that the ceremony was postponed for the present on account of the preparations for the war. The following day, in a letter to the Emperor, the Pope withdrew his approval of the Concordat. But the matter had gone too far for the Emperor to abandon entirely the project, so on the 30th March the Regency was announced at a kind of fete at the court given at the Élysée. With considerable ceremony, Marie-Louise was formally invested with the title of regent, in the presence only of the grand dignitaries, the ministers, the 2 imperial princesses who were in Paris at the time, and a few ladies of the court. In place of the long constitutional oath which the Empress was to have pronounced at Notre Dame, Marie-Louise simply swore to be faithful to the Emperor, and to carry out the orders which he might give her during his absence. Such was the feeble dénouement of this grandiose scheme which had so largely occupied the thoughts of the Emperor since his return. In place of an altar there was a green carpet; in place of a nation, a court; in place of the army, half a score of women in evening gowns. It would give a very false impression of Napoleon, however, to represent that during this winter of 1813 he was exclusively preoccupied with one idea. He held 2 or 3 meetings of the Council nearly every day, and never worked harder in his life. It required an immense effort to set in motion again the governmental machine which he had abandoned for 7 months and had neglected for 3 years. To govern France during his absence in Russia he had left Cambacérès, who was a pleutre, and ministers who were only head clerks. In place of Talleyrand he had a Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marais, Duc de Bassano, of whom Talleyrand viciously said, "I know of but one person more stupid than Monsieur Marais. It is the Duc de Bassano." Savary, Duc de Rovigo, who was only a gendarme, had succeeded Fouché as Minister of Police. Fouché, the humble, unfrocked priest, more powerful through his craftiness than the general at the head of 1,000,000 men, the universal spider spreading his net throughout the vast empire, until the master himself was helpless in its invisible web. In leaving Paris, the Emperor had not only retained all his authority, he had disorganized his administration, for even Marais followed the army. He alone continued to govern that vast empire, extending from the shores of the Baltic to the Pillars of Hercules, by couriers who took from 3 to 5 weeks to come and go between Paris and his headquarters. The correspondence which Napoleon carried on during the winter months of 1813 had never been more voluminous, nor more vigorous and diversified. But his greatest achievement was the immense army which he caused to spring from the earth, which he not only raised, but armed, equipped, clothed, and provisioned. In the midst of all these occupations, he found much time to give to the Empress, and hunted very frequently, in order to keep himself in training, as well as to give the lie to the reports in the English papers, which from day to day announced his declining health and approaching death. The receptions, the entertainments, the mode of life of the sovereigns and of the court were precisely the same as in preceding winters. Etiquette had resumed its full sway. Every Sunday there was the usual diplomatic audience before the Mass and the grand reception afterwards. The reviews of the Guard and of the Paris garrison were held as formerly. To read the reports in the Paris journals, no one would imagine that there were no longer any French troops beyond the Rhine, or that the Allies were preparing to invade the Empire. Marie-Louise appeared to be full of confidence. "I am sure," she wrote to her father, "that you share the happiness I have felt in seeing my husband again after an absence of nearly 7 months. The new year could not begin under more favorable auspices." In all her letters she speaks of her pleasure in "seeing the Emperor in such fine health, not fatigued, and even stouter." All the efforts of the Emperor had failed to make Marie-Louise popular with the Parisians. In vain he showed her in public. When he passed in a carriage with her and the King of Rome, or appeared with her in the state box at the theatres, the public applauded, but the cheers were all for him. When she visited alone the salons of sculpture or painting in the Louvre she was always coldly received. She could never overcome her unfortunate manner, and alienated all hearts. In his tours of inspection, to visit the public works going on in Paris, Napoleon made it a point of always taking the Empress with him, but she played only a passive role. She never utters a pleasant word, does not even find a graceful gesture, a complacent smile, or a flash of admiration. In fact, she was the exact opposite of Joséphine, who won all hearts. Even the entertainments of the court no longer amused her, and she wrote that she did not care to dance. The only things that she really liked were the morning rides with the Emperor, and the luncheons with him tete a tete in the new kiosk on the bank of the river, or the pavilion of Bagatelle in the Bois. She felt instinctively the antipathy which she aroused on every side, and clung all the closer to the tenderness and affection of her husband. She even regretted that there was no prospect of her having another child, and in a letter of congratulations to a friend said, "I am almost tempted to envy you, and to wish that it were not so, because I have not the same good fortune." At the end of the first week in March, Marie-Louise persuaded the Emperor to move to the Trianon. The party was a small one, comprising among others Duroc, Caulaincourt, Hortense, and Catherine, the wife of Jérôme, who had been chased from Westphalia. There were no entertainments of any kind, and the palace had never been so sad and quiet. The Emperor dined when he had time, often not before 8 o'clock, and then, overcome with fatigue, dragged his wife off to bed at 9. On the 23rd of March they returned to the Tuileries for the closing of the session of the Corps Législatif, but went a few days later to the Élysée, where the Emperor could work better, and also enjoy the promenades in the gardens. End of chapters 29 and 30.